This is Beyond Species, a podcast exploring issues around speciesism and the struggle to dismantle it. I'm Tofu Steve, and welcome to the episode. In this episode, we hear from Ghizzie. Ghizzie hosts the Scum Remover podcast, which focuses on Hunt Sabotage. He's also been sabbing for years, and we'll hear about some of the history of sabbing, as well as getting an insight into how the UK hunts work. Ghizzie covers the basics of how to sab and the strengths of non-hierarchical organising. We also hear what the future of hunting and hunt sabbing might look like. Do you want to start then by giving us a background to your activism?
Yeah, activism obviously has lots of different connotations, and to some extent people say kind of almost anything is activism, but I don't necessarily agree. However, choosing to become vegan about sort of 10 and a half years ago, kind of one of the first things that I did was go and volunteer in a veggie vegan kitchen in my city, my sort of hometown. And I guess that kind of, and I was there for a few years and made some really great friends, and I guess that counts as kind of the first real stepping stone towards sort of serious kind of direct action type activism. And then over the years, you know, I've done lots of kind of food based stuff, food projects, kind of food not bombs style things, but ultimately, eventually, kind of ended up involved with sabotaging hunts, and that came actually not really as a result of veganism, kind of, but it was really just because I was involved in sort of the local hardcore punk scene, and met up with someone at a gig who was running a stall and had just himself got involved with sabbing hunts, and we got talking, and that's how I got involved, really. And that was probably about 7 years ago now. Mm-hmm. And since then, my primary form of activism has definitely been sabbing, but I've also been involved in like anti-fascist marches in London. Been involved. I was up in the north of England, helped occupy an open cast coal mine, that kind of thing. Some anti-fracking stuff, etc. But the bulk of my activity has been focused on sort of anti-hunting. Yeah.
Okay. And when you said that when you went vegan, you started volunteering at a vegan kitchen, was that like a community kitchen type thing, or?
No, I mean it operated as a commercial kitchen, as a cafe, as like a veggie vegan cafe, and that was a time when it was kind of just before everything became really, you know, veganism became really big and trendy. So there's really only sort of 2 or 3 places in the city that kind of was solely dedicated to kind of non-meat options. But it was only able to get by really by having sort of 1 or 2 paid members of staff and everyone else as volunteers. But it kind of worked okay because everyone who volunteered was great, and we all had a great time, and that's kind of really what mattered.
So you said the way you discovered hunt sabbing was through the music scene.
Yeah.
So you met someone at a gig, something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, he actually organised the gig, and so I was running the sort of the merch table at the show, and I got speaking to him. I kind of recognised his name from just from Facebook social circles, I think. And initially I thought he was involved with Sea Shepherd. So I started kind of asking about Sea Shepherd, but he said he wasn't that involved with Sea Shepherd, but he had just started doing this thing called Hunt Sabotage. I was like, oh, that sounds good, because, actually one thing I didn't mention is that I was also involved in organising some veggie vegan fairs, I guess, in my hometown. And I've been doing that for a couple of years. I've been trying to get the local Hunt Sab group to the fairs, because it was very much trying to mix kind of like small business. Again, this is before veganism was big enough where you didn't, and yeah, and you kind of having fairs with sort of vegan stalls was a bit of a novelty. But I also tried to get at least, sort of half the stalls were sort of direct action groups, etc. And I spent bloody ages trying to get hold of the local Hunt Sab group and just wasn't able to do so. And then when I eventually came across this guy at the gig, and he told me he was involved in Hunt Sabbing, I was like, I've been trying to get in contact with them to come to this fair that I do. And it's like, well, I can tell you why that's why I haven't been able to get in contact with them, because they never bloody answer their emails. And I was like, yeah, I can tell. So it was kind of via the music scene, but also because I'd been sort of taken a partial interest as well previous to that.
Okay. And tell us about the Scum Remover podcast then. How did you start? What laid you down the path to starting a podcast, and what's it about?
The podcast was started basically because there wasn't a podcast about sabbing, as simple as that, and because I have spent a lot of time. I'm just really into podcasts as a medium, as a format, and had listened to podcasts for years already. And there are some really great podcasts out there, and I really enjoy listening to a lot of the kind of like anarchist podcasts, political ones, and realised that there wasn't one dedicated to sabbing, and because of the DIY nature of podcasting, it means that you can have these kind of really niche subject matters for a podcast, and just kind of dive really deeply into a single subject matter, because there's not really that much in terms of cost, like outlay. So yeah, I just did it. I was surprised that the HSA, the Hunt Sabotage Association, didn't already have one of its own, but then I later realised that's just because everyone involved in the HSA committee is as strapped for time as I am, basically. So that's why they hadn't got around to doing one themselves. So just thought I'd do one. Initially, there was one of my a friend of mine was also on board doing the interviews, but he kind of dropped out basically. So it ended up just being me doing the interviews, and that's what it's been like for a little while. Although I've also been on a hiatus for a few months at present.
And can you give us an example of some of the guests you've had on?
Yeah, so one of the ideas for the podcast is to try and have something that is of interest to other Hunt Sabs. That's actually the primary audience, I'd say. Is my intention for the audience is other Sabs, but also because it's a podcast that's available publicly, it's so that people who aren't necessarily active Sabs can also listen in and kind of learn from those conversations. So the episodes have taken kind of a couple of different formats. Usually it's either I'm speaking to a person from a SAB group about that SAB group. So that's one format. So it's kind of speaking to different SAB groups. Or the other one is I'll be speaking to someone about kind of a type of tactic or equipment that's used to try and perhaps better learn how that equipment can be used out in the field. So in terms of the groups that I've spoken to, I try to focus initially on some of the new international groups that are popping up. So some of the early episodes are about Melbourne Hunt Sabs and Hunt Sabotage Sweden, just because they're in countries where Hunt Sabotage traditionally either hasn't existed or has been incredibly limited. So there's those, and then as time went on, I started speaking more to UK-based groups. So spoke to West Midlands Hunt Sabs when they were in the thick of their campaign against the Atherstone Hunt, who have subsequently shut down as a result of West Mids. So that's been a success for them. And then on the other side, there's lots of episodes on tactics and stuff. So episodes about how to use the hunting horn, how to use a drone for sabbing, how to use a gizmo, which is like an MP3 player, which maybe we'll talk about a little later. I think it's quite a variety of different types of episodes, despite it being very focused in its subject matter.
Okay. So hunt sabbing then, there's probably, even amongst vegans, there's probably some misconceptions about it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm trying to think what the public perception is. I guess it's mixed, but it's interesting that I think it's something like 85% of the UK public support the ban on hunting.
Yeah. That's definitely. I mean, that's the statistic that's often wheeled out. I mean, I don't want to be sort of a downer on anything, but I don't know how true that is. And part of the reason that I'm skeptical is because it comes from the League Against Cruel Sports, and I think they're trying to perhaps make it seem more than it really is. So that 85% statistic, in my experience, possibly. I don't know if it actually is that high if you were to actually go around and ask every single person in the UK. I do think that there is, a majority of people are against hunting, but 85% is a really high is a really high figure.
Yeah, too good to be true, really.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I wonder. I think probably with the public, like a lot of things, some people will have strong views on it. Most actually won't. Will
Yeah,
just be
exactly.
will be indifferent because they're not out seeing animals being hunted. If they're not living rurally, I just think most people just can't, and probably think that it's just something that happens on a small scale every now and then. Some people on horses with red jackets ride about, and
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I think you're exactly right. I think like the public perception of hunting, is exactly like it doesn't reflect the reality of what hunting is, and that's not any fault of the public, the so-called public, and it's just because of how hunting is kind of both. I don't know. It's like Schrodinger's hunting. It's both kind of like really well known and knowledge of it is widespread, but at the same time, very little about it is known amongst the general public. So I think a majority of people certainly think that hunting no longer happens. I think that is probably the majority position, although perhaps that is changing a little bit now. But I think most people just assumed after the ban it stopped. And then I've certainly spoken to people who think that hunting maybe happens like once a month or something like that. And that is definitely not the case. Hunts will go out at least twice a week. Some hunts will go out 4 times a week. So every week for like 8 months, basically. So it happens a lot.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us then just a kind of, I guess, a broad introduction to what's involved in hunt sabbing? Kind of, I guess there's no typical day, but for someone who's maybe brand new to hunt sabbing in the UK and doesn't know what it's about, just what's involved in it.
Yeah. So kind of at the very core of sabotaging a hunt is to get between the hunting hounds and whatever animal they're chasing, or quarry is kind of like the hunting lingo for it, whatever quarry they're chasing. So that could be a fox, or it could be a hare, or it could be a deer. Those 3 are the most likely. And then you also have mink hunts, which happen through the summer, which is a bit of, I don't know, it's real sort of barrel scraping hunting, to be honest. But they, in theory, go after mink, but they often they come out of a tradition of otter hunting, so they often end up hunting otters as well. But the idea of sabotaging a hunt is to get between the hounds and the quarry, basically, to give the animal, the wildlife, just enough time to escape. one of my friends and fellow Sab actually put it best that the real hunt saboteurs are the animals themselves, of course, because they're the ones who ultimately are sabotaging the hunt. But our role is to try and sort of facilitate them sabotaging the hunt, facilitate them, making their own escape. So. Yeah, and in order to get between the hounds, I mean, that can be literally. So you might literally be in between the hounds and a fox, for example, or it may be kind of slightly metaphorical. But once you're kind of in that position, what you want to be doing is basically trying to distract or stop the hounds, and that's done with a variety of tools, most of which are the same tools that the hunt themselves use. So that would be like a hunting horn or a whip. And there's also a little device called a gizmo, which is an MP3 of a audio file of hounds in cry, played on a sort of a speaker, sort of a 15-watt speaker, which can fit in your pocket. A big pocket, but it can fit in your pocket. And the idea behind that is that hounds hunt. Usually they'll have one or two lead hounds, and once those lead hounds pick up the scent of an animal, they will go into cry, which is that kind of like baying sound that is perhaps most famously associated with hunting. And once those lead hounds start baying, start going into cry, all the rest of the pack will then follow the sound of the lead hounds. So the idea of the gizmo is to emulate the lead hound, basically, so that the pack is then drawn towards whoever's holding the gizmo. So you're pulling the hounds towards you rather than the hounds going off, after an animal or whatever. And then the whip is used to basically, hounds are trained to stop at the sound of a whip cracking. So you, in theory, would hopefully be able to use that to help stop hounds. The hunting horn is probably kind of self-explanatory. The huntsman uses it for a whole variety of things, for controlling the hounds. And if you can emulate what they're doing, then you can kind of do the opposite of what they're doing. So rather than encouraging the hounds to continue hunting a hare or a fox, then you blow a horn to stop them from doing that. And then you also have voice calls, because the hunt will use voice calls as well, various different sort of phrases that the hounds are trained to respond to. So in combination with all of those things, hopefully if you're in a position where you see the hounds on the line of an animal, then you can use those techniques and tools to, if nothing else, just distract the hounds for 2 seconds, and that might be enough to let to help a deer or hare or fox escape. So that's the very core of sabotaging a hunt. But then there's so much around it as well. There's the whole day is spent tracking a hunt, following it around wherever they're hunting. So usually they'll be hunting in an area confined to sort of several fields, although how many fields that is will depend on the hunt itself and kind of the area. And then there's also all the stuff kind of outside of the hunting area itself. So like, how do you find out where a hunt is going to be on the Saturday? Well, someone might give you some information if you're lucky, and if you don't receive any information, then you may have to kennel sit. So basically just sit outside of the kennels where the hounds are kept, wait for the hound van to leave, and then follow the hound van all the way to wherever it's meeting that day. And that in itself can be a whole mission with dangerous driving, trying to lose sabs and that kind of thing. So
yeah. I've experienced that, following a hound van once, and I was the driver. And,
oh Christ!
It was the hunt master actually who was driving it. And he kept going around this loop to loop like this. We went around about 4 or 5 times. It was quite frustrating.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've I've seen some pretty like really awful driving from people transporting hounds trying to lose like the car that I'm in, for example, like people on busy motorways and not indicating and then suddenly turning off and that kind of thing, or even doing like U-turns across like the center of a motorway. It's just madness.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, it leads to a lot of. I mean, I've seen a lot of the videos from different hunt sab groups, and some of the irresponsible behavior by the hunt is really disgusting. You know, putting a lot of lives at risk, animal lives, and
Yeah.
also human lives. Uh, what do you think then? So, the image of a sab that we have is people in camouflage or all black, masked up. I wonder if this is, and I know the reasons for that. You know, it's important to be masked up, not because you're trying to scare people, but because members of the hunt and hunt support can try and identify you and either try and give you a hard time online or in your local community or whatever. So it makes sense. But I wonder if there's a kind of that's a barrier to people who want to get involved in animal rights or vegans who maybe aren't active who think, oh, that looks a little bit kind of paramilitary, you know, that's a bit scary. Do you think there's an image problem with sabbing, I guess I'm trying to say, in terms of trying to attract people to the role?
Yes, it's a good question. I mean, I am one of those people who's dressed in all black and masked up, so you know, I'm definitely on board with that for a whole variety of reasons. Not necessarily. I mean, the personal safety thing is is almost always the kind of first reason that people do it. But there are other reasons as well. I think, for example, one of the most important reasons for me is that by masking up and kind of dressing fairly uniformly, it facilitates kind of in theory anyone can participate, and there's no sort of real ego. There's no sort of personal attachment to the actions that are happening because it's just done by people who you can't really recognize if that makes sense. It's not trying to put your face onto what you're doing, which is a you know it's one of the worst things about kind of contemporary so-called vegan activism is you know celebrities and things like that. But yeah, I can see also why it would be discouraging for some people. I actually don't think it's that much of a barrier um, for most people. I think certainly in my experience, when I've spoken to people who want to join our group, and I know this is also true for many other groups, that it's not an expectation to mask up by any means. There's no contract you have to sign. There's no agreement that you have to say yes to before you can join the groups, which has a clause, you know, saying you must dress in black and you must cover your face at all times. In my group, probably about half the people mask up and half the people don't. It's kind of it's a personal decision, and I think that's true for most groups. And there are some groups who just don't mask up at all. The first one that comes to my mind would be Peterborough Hunt Sabs. Basically, none of them mask up.
Mm.
I think I remember reading Cheshire Hunt Sabs or like last season stopped kind of masking up as well. And yeah, and you know, I think North Wales also kind of don't really mask up, that kind of thing. So there are definitely groups where a majority of people don't really mask up. It's very individual to the group, but I don't think there's any group that would expect you to cover your face.
Mhm.
But I think there are practical reasons, certainly for kind of dressing in dark clothing or kind of camo clothing, because I was on a mass sab fairly recently, and by far the easiest way to spot who was standing in a field is just to see what color clothes they were wearing
Mm.
from a
Yeah.
distance. So that's one sort of very easy practical reason to kind of dress in dark clothing.
Yeah, that does help. Yeah, figuring out who's who because there's hunt support as well, right? Which are kind of like people just following the hunt for like a day out and watching it with binoculars and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah,
Uh,
there's a very strict hierarchy to the sort of structure of a hunt. And the hunt supporters, the kind of the car followers or foot followers, will be, they're at the bottom of the pile. They'll have paid £5 to find out where the meat is, and they're not given any info. They just have to try and do the best they can on the day. They're basically in the same position as us, but with far less resources, I guess, to keep track of a hunt.
mm,
um,
mm,
yeah, and you have like the ride who follow the hunt itself, and then the hunt itself is really only just sort of like a handful of people. It will be the people in red jackets or green jackets who are in control of the hounds or responsible for controlling the hounds, and then at the top you have the masters of the hunt who are responsible for the long-term operation of the hunt. But yeah, you depending on the hunt, you'll have a variety of different followers, and some of them can be out in the field, following the hunt, and it's helpful to differentiate yourself from them
mm.
when you're working in a group and don't necessarily always have direct voice communication with each other.
Yeah. And do the riders pay for the hunt as well, right? So they pay to attend for the day.
Yeah, so um, as far as I know, most hunts will ask the riders to pay a subscription for the season, which will be it will vary depending on how prestigious a hunt is, but um, it could be, let's say, £800 subscription for the season, and then they'll also have to pay every time they go out. So they'll pay a cap every time that they ride that season, which may be 25 quid or £50, something like that. So they'll be paying to follow the hunt, and then they'll get the opportunity to ride across all this lovely. It is often very beautiful countryside, and they'll have the additional guidance of the field master, and who will be in direct contact with members of the hunt itself.
Mhm. Okay, so yeah, so they're having a nice day out riding and having a bit of action and adventure following the hunt then.
Yeah. I mean, from what I gather, like the reason a lot of horse riders like to go out riding with a hunt is because it's challenging riding. It's like technically challenging riding for a horse rider, because it's requires a lot of stamina, and because the terrain can often be quite difficult. It requires sort of technical skill as well. And so if if you're into horse riding, then that's one of the reasons why going out with the hunt is appealing.
Mm, okay. I didn't think of that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm.
Um, so for people that wanted to support the SABs or get involved in sabbing, but are maybe not really confident at getting involved with the direct action side of things, there's other roles for people to do.
Yeah, do you mean, are you asking sort of within the context of being out sort of on the day, like
Yeah,
following a hunt?
yeah, on the day. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So I guess when people think about sabbing, they're thinking of the people who are out on foot in the fields, kind of tailing the hunt across fields, and that's certainly kind of a big part of sabbing. But it's really only kind of half the story, really, because because the hunter on horseback, you're not going to be able to keep up with them on foot. So the other side to that is that you have a lot of people who are out driving vehicles, and so you have drivers, which is probably the perhaps kind of the most important role in many ways in sabbing, because without a driver, you're not going anywhere. Basically, you're never going to keep up. The first part of their role is kind of to ferry the foot sabs around to get them to the right locations and things like that. But they can also play a role in sabbing themselves, because sometimes if you've got sabs who are 2 miles away from a road and the hunt are right back up at the road, you're not going to get SABs back to the road in time to kind of keep up with the hounds. So then it's the responsibility of drivers to maintain that kind of visual contact, and they can do that with a car as long as it stays within sight, as long as the hunt stays within sight of the road. So there's that, and there's also the navigational role, which is basically the driver's co-pilot, and that person is usually responsible for all of the tasks that the driver can't do, because obviously they need to concentrate on driving, on remaining on the road. So that will be things like reading a map, radio work, to stay in communication with other groups via the radio, and camera work as well. So they'll it's really important to have cameras in the cars, because you're probably at your most vulnerable in a car. You're probably more likely to get attacked, people coming up to your windows and that kind of thing. So having a camera is helpful. It's kind of the first line of deterring any sort of violent behaviour.
That's it's interesting that we've moved on to the violence aspect of it, because I think that's something that really needs to be kind of explained, because obviously a lot of the public seem to think that it's the SABs that are sort of violent people getting in front of hassling horses and hassling people and scaring children and things like this. But obviously there's a lot of aggression coming from the hunt side. What are your thoughts or experiences on that? Has it increased, do you think, since you've been sabbing, or is it just kind of always, up and down? And
yeah, I think it's always been up and down. I think to some extent it's probably, from having spoken to people who've sabbed for a long time, I think the violence is probably a lot less now overall than it was before the hunting ban. So I think it's to a large extent overall less violent now than it was before the ban. However, I think one of the big differences now is the nature of social media means it's a lot more visible. So you do hear about some kind of quite spectacularly aggressive, if not outright violent situations, such as what's a fairly recent one? There was I think a Devon hunt sab who got dragged across a field by a quad bike and had her lung punctured and had to be airlifted to hospital. I think that was last season, that kind of thing. But the reality is, I think the violence is not as common as perhaps people may think it is, based just on sort of reading social media or kind of reading the news. And it will also vary from region to region. So kind of where I am in the country, we don't really deal with any sort of physical violence from the hunt, and we're very glad about that. But then if you go elsewhere, such as, I don't know, the West Country is quite famous for being quite violent, and sort of Yorkshire is seemingly they get a lot of shit up in Yorkshire at the moment, like Sheffield Sabs and West Yorks. But yeah, if you think that most groups are out at least once a week, if not 2 or 3 times a week across the country, the amount of violence is relatively low. I would hope that anyone who's kind of thought about sabbing, but has perhaps been put off by reports or sort of videos of violence, isn't too put off, because it's not that common. However, it does happen, so I'm not trying to downplay it by any means. It does happen, and sometimes it can be quite horrible. Sabs by and large are, take a position of not being the aggressor. I can't speak for every group, because I don't know every group, and I don't know every individual in every group, nor have I sabbed with every group, of course. But by and large, Sabs will not take the position of being an aggressor. However, I think every SAB group will absolutely stand up for themselves in defence, in self-defence, if it came to that, as far as they're able to do so. Because if you don't, it's a bit of a psychology thing. With some people, you can kind of like get away with taking a beating, and then they might take pity on you. But I think with like hunters and the hunting community. If they were to kind of attack you and you showed some sort of weakness, then really they would kind of continue doing that. They're bullies, and the best way to kind of counteract the violence of a bully is to stand up for yourself, really. And so I think that's the position that most SAB groups hold. However, I don't think anyone goes out looking for the fight, or most people don't go out looking for the fight, because ultimately our priority is to stop hounds from killing wildlife, and we can't be doing that if we're caught up in a fist fight with a bunch of thugs, rural thugs. So
Yeah. How many SAB groups are there in the UK then, do you think?
Yeah, hard to put a number on that. I reckon probably 50 to 60 at the moment, because groups are kind of coming and going quite a bit. Over the last few years, the numbers seem to have fluctuated. So you have some groups kind of pop up and only survive for about half a season and then fold again. But then some groups have kind of come up really recently and have really stuck it out. So like there was for a brief moment in time, there was an Isle of Wight Hunt Sabs, but they seem to just kind of disappear without a trace very quickly. But then Mendip Hunt Sabs have come up recently, and they've been really on top of it and doing a really good job of kind of sticking around. So yeah, I think probably something like 50 to 60 groups at present.
Okay. And how many SABs do you think will, well, I suppose it's hard to say what the average size is, but yeah, how many SABs do you think could be expected to go out what's the most SABs that would be out in the field in one of the bigger groups, say?
Yeah, well, I mean, a group like Guildford, which I think is a pretty big group, probably one of the biggest, like on a week to week basis, from what I gather, they seem to get about 25 SABs out on a Saturday. And then some groups are really small and kind of remain quite small over the long term. Can't think of anything off the top of my head, but they may only have sort of 4 or 5 people out on a Saturday. So the numbers can really wildly vary. But if we're taking sort of Saturday as a benchmark, I'd say in total there's only going to be let's say 700 to 800 people involved in sabbing on a Saturday across sort of England, Wales, and Scotland. I'd say, yeah. So it's not much, and also, a lot of hunts don't ever get sabbed. There are a lot of hunts across England and Wales. I think there's about 300 fox hunts, probably about another 60 or 70 hare hunts. So that would include harrier packs, beagle packs, and basset packs. And then there's a handful of like mink hunts and things like that. So we're talking sort of probably 450, 500 maybe hunts across the UK who are going to be out sort of on a weekly basis. So a lot of them go unsabbed. So although there's 700-800 sabs out on a Saturday, they're all focused on a very limited number of hunts.
So yeah, I wasn't aware that there was actually that many hunts, and I wonder if a lot of people don't realize that as well, because it would be really great to see like a huge influx of people wanting to take direct action against hunts, and for all, to be able to cover all those hunts. When you think how many vegans you can get to a festival to buy loads of nice food, but then to get people out on a Saturday and it does take up your whole Saturday, pretty much. It's not glamorous at all. It's kind of, it can be quite physically demanding, but I do think that most people say that, because I have heard people say, oh, I've thought about hunt sabbing, but I'm not fit enough. But I don't think any of us are particularly that fit.
No,
You know,
no, it's
you do
true.
some, you do sometimes get some people who are like, yeah, I'm a marathon runner anyway, so this is no bother for me. But most of us are not particularly athletic. But you just need to get out there. You know, having numbers, it seems, is important in sabbing. The more people you can get out into that field, the better, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, on your point of sort of fitness, I'd say I totally agree with you. It's like if you can walk, that's the thing. It's like there's actually not that much running involved in most sabbing. Most of the day is just spent walking. So if you can walk, that's just kind of as fit as you need to be out on foot. And then, you know, as we said, there are also other roles, kind of car-based roles, which don't even kind of require that much walking, for example. And in terms of numbers, yeah, I think perhaps there's also kind of two different sort of schools of thought on this. I think there is kind of one style of sabbing which is basically to kind of swamp loads of sabs out into the field and kind of use numbers to kind of overcome, keep on top of the hunt and then just kind of overcome it basically.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are kind of groups or parts of the country where that's just not possible because you don't have enough people to do that in the area, and so in that case it's still possible to kind of sabotage the hunt, but I guess it requires a bit more tactical planning or tactical thinking to try and stay on top of the hunt because you've got far fewer people, but it's still possible. I mean, it's possible for one person to sabotage a hunt in theory. If one person can blow a hunting horn, that's kind of all you'd need to disrupt a hunt, really. But yeah, I mean, definitely every sab group could always use more people. There's never no sab group is going to really sort of say that they've got too many members. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, they can always use the people, right? They can allocate
yeah.
them to where they need them. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A second vehicle or a third vehicle or a fourth vehicle can always be found to get the people out there. So yeah.
Okay. So thinking about the politics of where the Hunt Saboteurs Association came out of then and kind of the links to the animal liberation movement, I know that they're part of the anti-fascist network. So probably going to go without saying that Hunt Sabs are kind of left-wing aligned, kind of in terms of politics.
I'd say that subgroups in their format and in their structure and the kind of sub network in its format and structure is incredibly anarchic. Everything is organized as kind of an autonomous cells, and nobody really answers to anyone else, even though there is an HSA, with sort of a 12-member committee. They don't have any control over groups. Like, they don't tell groups what to do, and if they tried, I don't think most groups would really listen to them. And you can completely be a subgroup and have absolutely no contact at all with the HSA. So it's very autonomous. So it's anarchic in its form, and in terms of the kind of the politics of perhaps the people involved, I'd say, yeah, broadly, you get lots of kind of, you do get lots of kind of punks and anarchists involved, definitely. I'm definitely along those lines. But I think one of the strengths of sabbing is that it also has a lot of people that aren't just kind of like politically radical, or at least typically anarchos or anything like that. That it has a lot of people who are, I'd say broadly kind of left wing, but aren't necessarily that radical, but are still doing something which really is quite a radical form of direct action even to this day. So yeah, and its connection with the anti-fascist network is basically, it was a way for the HSA to make it clear that that fascism, racism, nationalism is not welcome within the SAB network. And I think it came about. I spoke to the chair of the HSA in sort of a two-parter episode, which you can go back and listen to if you want to, from Scum Remover. And I think he said that it came basically at a time when it appeared as though sort of the right wing was trying to muscle its way into animal rights, which it's still doing to this day, and to some extent with a degree of success. As of your Instagram account quite clearly details, for example, the shitty position that like Anonymous for the Voiceless holds, that kind of thing. The sort of rhetoric that's coming out of Anonymous for the Voiceless, that would never have taken any sort of root in the HSA or the SAB network at all, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
There's the horizontal organizing then, but it doesn't mean that basically everyone who's a Hunt Sab is like a full-on anarchist. It's just organized in a non-hierarchical way,
Yeah.
along some kind of anarchist principles, and that kind of keeps it, fair and allows that kind of cell network to. I guess it's a thing that keeps it effective as well.
Yeah, completely. Because it's effective because groups can kind of live and die without having a major impact on any other group really in the network. And most groups are largely self-funded, so they'll do their own fundraising or put their own money into what they're doing. The HSA can provide grants, but they're usually only for either emergencies or to kind of buy a vehicle. That's kind of the main use for grants. But that autonomous structure is, I don't know, it's incredibly effective just because it's informal. There's no paperwork or anything like that. It's just groups of people getting together because they can work together to achieve a common goal, which is to stop hunts and stop hunting.
Yeah.
And it's very flexible. And to be honest, like once, in my opinion, once you have kind of been in a group that organizes in that way, it's really hard to understand why every group doesn't organize in that way. And because there's no hierarchy there, it prevents any sort of abuse of power or anything like that, or it drastically limits any abuses of power. So that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, it builds that really kind of authentic relationships, I would say, because you're out in the field and you trust the people that you're with. You have to work together in the moment with a lot of things happening to get the best results. And you need to be able to work with people. So it really encourages that kind of just everyone understanding that you're there to get the job done. And there's no space for egos there. There's no space for performative activism. You don't see Hunt Sabs posing. When you do usually see Hunt Sabs in photos, they've got a little fox emoji over their face, or they're masked up, or whatever. It's not about, look at what a great thing I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly.
It takes away from the individual. It really keeps the focus on just a group of people. You don't really know who they are, but they're out there and they're taking direct action to save lives.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the ALF has a similar structure because it grew out of SABs in the 70s with Ronnie Lee, and that's kind of the power of the ALF as it's almost become an aesthetic these days, but the power of the ALF and kind of what it does and what it has done throughout the past 30-40 years is for exactly the same reasons. It's anonymous, so you kind of often don't really know who's involved. It's all the majority of the focus is placed on the action, which ultimately is what matters. It's not the people, because in theory anyone who feels that they want to do something should be able to do that with as little fear of kind of reprise or comeback as possible, especially because much more with the ALF than with with sabbing, what you're doing is crossing some legal boundaries.
Yeah.
But from a sort of ethical perspective, removing sort of the individual from any sort of publicity is really important, exactly because of that. It removes the ego, which is important. But that doesn't necessarily prevent egos from developing within groups by any means. But again, sort of the nature of autonomous organising means that if egos develop, then the impact and any sort of negative impact is easily limited and sort of contained. If you compare that to, for example, Roger Hallam and Extinction Rebellion, and he's in my opinion, he's clearly on an ego trip, and the impact of his ego trip is horrendous because he's featured he's all over the Guardian, and that trickles all the way down through the whole organization. And that you don't want that. That's an awful position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's said so much problematic stuff now, it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it seems like people are unable to stop him, from saying this stuff. It's like because he's this this founding father of this movement, seemingly.
Yeah, or even following your Insta account, like the actions or the words of Paul Bashir from Anonymous for the Voiceless. The only way that people can get away from that is by completely disassociating themselves from AV, and that's really good on all the groups that have done that. But the fact that one person or sort of a small group of people's words and sort of ideas can be so toxic to an entire movement is terrible.
Yeah, that's a real good analysis, actually, of one of the weaknesses of hierarchy is that once you've got those, a few people at the top who are just incompetent and full of ignorance and hate, it damages the whole organization, even though they don't see it that way. But in time, maybe they will.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, a lot of people who volunteered for that organization have been through pretty shitty experiences of bullying, gaslighting, people experiencing sexual harassment and just all this kind of stuff that I just can't see that happening in the sabbing world, really, because it would be knocked on the head straight away.
No, I can't say it's never happened. It probably has, unfortunately, has happened at some point when something, sabbing is. I think it's widely accepted that Hunt Sabotage is kind of the longest running form of direct action that's hasn't got a broken lineage. It's just remained consistent since the HSA. Well, the HSA was founded in 1963, and then there was about a decade before the HSA where kind of sabbing was kind of coming together as well. And when something's been running for that long, 60 years, it's all sorts of shit happens. So I can't say it's never happened, but certainly the number of stories must be very limited, because I can think of one instance that I've heard of, and that wasn't anything nearly as basically just some shitty sexism between a couple of groups, and that was kind of, that's not good, but it's by no means kind of at the scale of what's happening within AV, for example.
What's the future for sabbing in terms of technology or strategy?
I think the development of technology will certainly influence what SAB groups are capable of. The most recent notable step forwards has definitely been the drone, having an eye in the sky for. I mean, I've not personally actually used one. Our group hasn't used one in the field, But from the groups that have and what I've read and spoken with people about, that has provided a huge advantage in being able to keep an eye on the hunt, and as a result of being able to keep an eye on the hunt, being able to better place SABs or better direct SABs on the ground, to kind of keep up with the hounds. And then the secondary function is that you can also get some amazing footage with a drone as well.
Yeah.
So I think as technology develops, that will influence things. But what will be the next major sort of addition to sabbing? I don't know, because I don't know how technology is going to develop. There's nothing obvious to me at the moment. I know that groups have been using trackers, or various different groups have been using trackers in different ways for a little while now. So that's one development, that groups 20 years ago or 30 years ago wouldn't have been able to do. So yeah, how it develops in that respect will kind of just depend on how technology develops. Perhaps just occurred to me, increasingly miniaturized cameras may become a sort of a bigger part of sabbing, if you can get essentially like surveillance cameras, which are the size of a dice or something like that. That would probably have a huge impact on sabbing as well, in terms of stuff outside of the field, just keeping an eye on things.
Okay.
And what other aspects of the future of sabbing are? I mean, fundamentally, what sabbing is, what it comes down to, is getting between the hounds and wildlife, and that's never going to change. So the core of it will always be the hunting horn, the whip, citronella, which I haven't really actually mentioned yet, which is citronella essential oil mixed up with water, and then sprayed over the ground where a fox or a deer or a hare has run, to just kind of cover the scent, so that hounds can't necessarily or have a much harder time following it beyond where that citronella has been sprayed. So that will always remain the core of sabbing, I think. But yeah, I think another aspect to the future of sabbing will be legal developments. The Conservatives have been making a thing since they came into power about how the Hunting Act is going to remain in place. But what they're saying is, nothing's going to change. And what that means is, because hunting continues as though there is no ban, that just means hunting's going to continue like it always has. And I think what is potentially going to happen in the long term is that the government will introduce laws that increasingly criminalise all forms of protest, including sabbing, and that will be the way that they try and facilitate an easier life for hunts, by making sabbing more difficult, rather than trying to repeal the ban itself. Obviously, Scotland has different laws, but with regards to hunting, but they're kind of similar, to my understanding, in the end. Hopefully, in Scotland, I don't, to be honest, I don't know that much about the SNP, so I don't know where they stand on issues of like protest and direct action, but hopefully they're not as vicious as the Conservatives.
Yeah, they're definitely better than the Tories. I could say that much.
Yeah,
they've got a lot of problems with themselves. They're not the best when it comes to animal welfare issues, if you want to call it that. They're quite supportive of the rural economy, and I guess hunting kind of fits in with that. But then they also like to make sure that everyone knows that we kind of take a different approach to things than England. So it might be that kind of nationalist sort of approach, or wanting to seem more progressive, might go in our favor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's maybe the best we can hope for right now, I think.
Yeah, because they were, was it, I guess less than a year ago at this point, there was, from what I recall, discussions around actually strengthening the, what's the law? Is it the Protection of Wild Mammals Act in Scotland? Is that what it's called?
Rings a bell, yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, I think there were talks about strengthening that, and then the SNP ultimately just said, "Nah, not interested," and then kind of just dropped the whole thing altogether. So, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe the best thing is that at least they won't make it more difficult for people taking action against hunts. Whereas I think the Tories almost definitely will, if as their parliament goes on.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is this whole thing about painting any sort of activism as a form of extremism. I mean, it's such a, you can see which direction they're trying to take it,
Yeah, for sure.
So, well, who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah. So, and yeah, apart from that, the future is also dependent on sort of hunting itself, really. Like, how much longer can hunting go on? I think it's losing a lot of. Sabbing is not the only thing that's killing hunting by any means. I think hunting is in decline. It's a dying pastime, thankfully, and sabbing is one part of that. But there are other factors as well, some of which are more positive than others. I think one of the reasons that hunting is losing out is that landowners are basically giving their land over to shooting rather than to hunting, because shooting is still legal, so they don't have to worry about that, and it's a lot less destructive on the land itself, because you just got a bunch of people walking basically, rather than dozens of horses and hounds trampling all over your fields. And they get way more money for it. Shooting is expensive. Like, each individual is going to be paying £200-300 just to spend the day on a couple of fields. Whereas I can't imagine they get much money from the hunt, and traditionally the hunt wouldn't even pay landowners, so I don't even know if they do these days. So I think that's kind of another big reason that hunting is in decline, is that landowners basically just don't want the hunt. They'd rather have shooters on their land. From a sabbing perspective, that's obviously not so great, because shoots probably kill way more overall in terms of animals. And then, yeah, I think just the general public opinion. I think one of the things that a lot of subgroups have done increasingly well is via social media and via the use of body cams and camcorders, is just bring the topic of hunting like right back up into the public consciousness. And hunts basically just keep shooting themselves in the foot through their own behaviour. And that's, how long can that last for them? Really, it can't be. It can't last forever, really.
Yeah. So the public, the way the hunt looks in the public perception is maybe it's showing them in their true light. So hopefully, it's difficult to know, isn't it? But yeah.
It's just like, how long can hunting last? I mean, I would like to think that hunting, like, all of the kennels will be shut down within my lifetime, but I don't know. There's a lot of hunts out there, and they're very, very committed to hunting because it's not just it's not like a slaughterhouse where it's essentially it's like a profit making business for the people at the top, and it's a job for the people who work in there. Hunting is a business, like most hunts do essentially operate as a business, but it's part of the fabric of an identity. It's a cultural thing, so it kind of runs really deeply within the people that actually practice it. And I'm sure they'll fight to the bitter end for it, but that end hopefully will be sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And at least we know that until then, the SAB groups will never go away and never stop doing what they're doing. So
Yeah, no, I think now, that can has been opened. I don't think it'll ever be closed again, really.
yeah, yeah, it's good. 60 years and counting.
Yeah, pretty much.